Okay, let's unpack this. What if the reality we perceive, as smooth and constant is actually flickering, like on and off?
And flickering incredibly fast.
Right, at a rate that's just hard to grasp. 22 trillion times every second. Our senses wouldn't even notice the gaps.
Exactly. And then the kicker is, what if this fundamental pulse, this sort of cosmic on-off switch, is somehow deeply connected to consciousness itself?
Yeah, it's a pretty wild theoretical landscape we're stepping into here. It's a model, apparently developed with AI assistance, that tries to build a physics around exactly that idea.
Well, what's really fascinating, I think, is how it flips the usual perspective.
Mm.
Instead of matter first, consciousness later, maybe as an add-on.
Uh-huh.
This model says, no, maybe matter is essentially condensed consciousness
Mm-hmm.
and energy transformation. That's driven by consciousness right at the base level.
It's a radical rethink, really, of what reality is actually made of. So our source for this deep dive, just so you know, is a YouTube transcript. It's from the Cliff High Sci-Fi World channel, a video called How to Build a Flux Liner in This Materium.
Right?
Now, we should say up front, the part we're digging into the math framework for energy use in their theoretical UFO model, it gets pretty technical.
It does lean heavily on physics and math concepts.
Yeah, the source itself kind of warns that it's maybe best suited for folks with that background, so we're definitely wading into some complex waters.
But the aim is to pull out the core ideas, right? The really compelling bits.
Exactly. This attempt to, create a mathematical language for a reality driven by consciousness, it's significant, even if it's very theoretical right now.
And the AI assist angle adds another layer, doesn't it? Makes you wonder about new ways of understanding that might come from, human AI collaboration.
For sure. So our mission here, if you're sticking with us, is to explore some of these core concepts, these mathematical ideas.
See if we can make them a bit more understandable.
Right. And highlight what they might imply for how we think about energy, time,
Here.
even where new things, novelty, come from.
Yeah.
Think of it as a backstage pass to some, well, seriously cutting edge, maybe speculative ideas about existence itself.
And just to give you a roadmap, this AI-assisted model lays out 10 fundamental base constructs and principles. It's quite a list.
Yeah, what's on there?
Well, you've got nonlinear harmonic oscillations. That's about the super fast pulse. Then consciousness as a scalar field permeating everything.
Yeah.
An energy transformation framework that's consciousness-driven.
Okay.
Things like flux dynamics, non-Euclidean geometry for space-time, these probabilistic novelty operators, how new stuff might emerge.
Uh-huh.
Even irreversibility of time linked to the pulse, coordinate transformations using complex numbers in new ways, and finally, consciousness-driven field equations. The idea that consciousness actually determines reality.
Wow, okay.
Yeah,
That's ambitious is one word for it. A whole system.
it really is.
Now, because the math does get pretty dense, and we want to keep this manageable, we're going to zoom in. We'll focus on two specific areas the source highlights for their mathematical richness.
Which are?
Flux dynamics. So, how they model that fundamental pulse and these novelty operators, their mathematical take on how new things emerge. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. Flux dynamics first.
Okay, so this core idea, this flux pulse,
Yeah.
what's the basic concept?
At its heart, the model imagines reality isn't continuous, but has this fundamental rhythm, a pulse cycling between creation and destruction.
And the speed is just mind-blowing.
Absolutely staggering. 22 trillion times a second, that's 2.2 times 10 to the power of 13 hertz. It's almost impossible to truly visualize that frequency.
Like a cosmic strobe light flashing faster than anything we can comprehend?
Pretty much. Imagine trying to flip a light switch that many times in 1 second.
Right, so how do they try and capture that mathematically?
Well, they use a familiar tool from physics, a sinusoidal wave function. The equation looks like 6 equals aos 2 pi tau plus 5.
Okay, let's decode that a bit. 6x. That's just the name for this flux wave.
Right, the function describing the wave over space x and time t.
Got it. And AO, that's amplitude.
Yes, amplitude. But here's the twist in this model. They propose it's related to the intensity of conscious energy.
Ah, okay. So not just the height of the wave, but somehow tied to the strength of consciousness. Like a bigger wave means more conscious influence.
That's the interpretation they seem to be putting forward, yes.
Yeah.
It directly links the physical property of the wave, its amplitude, to this non-physical concept of conscious energy intensity.
Interesting. Then F is that crazy frequency, 22 trillion hertz. A is just time. What about the little 5 at the end?
That's the phase offset. Think of it like setting the starting point on a spinning wheel. It subtly adjusts the timing within each pulse cycle.
So it might influence whether a cycle starts more on the creation side or the destruction side?
Precisely. It modulates that balance within each incredibly brief pulse.
Okay. But how do they model the instantaneous snap of destruction and recreation they think happens? A smooth wave doesn't quite capture that, does it?
Good point. For that, they bring in a different mathematical tool, the direct delta function. The notation is Cflex t equals delta t minus nt.
Okay, the delta function. For those of us whose math is a bit rusty, that's like an infinitely tall, infinitely thin spike at one specific point and zero everywhere else.
Exactly. It's perfect for representing something instantaneous. Here, n is basically just counting the pulse cycles 1, 2, 3, and so on. And t is the period, the tiny duration of one cycle, which is just 1 divided by that huge frequency f.
So at each specific moment, end blink, this function spikes, representing that instant of destruction and recreation. It paints a picture of reality not as a smooth flow, but like a super high-speed film reel.
Frame, frame, frame.
That's a great analogy. At the most fundamental level described here, it's discrete pulses, not a continuous stream.
Okay, so we have the pulsing flux. How does the consciousness part connect mathematically? They introduce another field, the consciousness field, symbolizes phi xt, and they link it to the flux using what's called a scalar field equation. It looks like hollow square phi x plus L3 equals 0.
Right, the hollow square, remember that from physics class, the D'Alembertian operator.
That's the one. It involves changes in both space and time. Written out, it's T2 partial differential 2 minus C2 nabba 2. It basically describes wave propagation.
Okay. And the lambda L3 in their notation, that's a coupling constant.
Yes. It essentially sets the strength of the interaction. How strongly does this consciousness field phi talk to or interact with the energy represented in the equation?
And the last bit, that L3 term with the subscript 3, that's the field interacting with itself.
Exactly. That's a nonlinear term. It means consciousness, in this view, isn't just a passive background. It has its own internal dynamic. It interacts with itself.
So it's actively shaping itself, and through that coupling constant shaping reality.
That's the implication. The nonlinearity suggests a richness, maybe even a self-awareness or self-organizing capacity within the consciousness field itself, which then influences the flux.
Wow, okay. So a pulsing reality, deeply interwoven with a dynamic, self-interacting consciousness field. That's the foundation.
That's the bedrock of this model, yes.
Now, how does anything new ever happen in this system? If it's all just pulsing and interacting, where does genuine novelty come from?
Ah, good question. This is where the novelty operators come in. The core idea is that novelty, unexpected events, new things forming, isn't just random chaos.
Uh-huh.
It arises as specific probabilistic events. And these events are triggered by, let's say, fluctuations or interactions within the flux itself. Think of tiny random wobbles in those ultra-fast pulses.
Okay, so the pulse isn't perfectly steady. It has little jitters.
That seems to be the idea.
Yeah.
And mathematically, they represent this novelty as perturbations, small disturbances or additions to that original flux wave.
So the equation changes slightly.
Right. Instead of just SXT, the flux wave becomes S novel XT equals SXT plus NXT.
Okay, S novel XT is the flux with novelty. SXT is the regular flux. And NXT is the new bit, the novelty perturbation.
Exactly. And notice it's multiplied by a small coefficient, E.
What does that E signify?
Well, being small suggests that maybe these fundamental novelty events are often tiny, perhaps individually below our threshold of perception.
But they could add up, or maybe a big one happens occasionally.
Precisely. It implies that observable novelty in our world might be the result of many small perturbations accumulating, or perhaps a rare larger fluctuation.
Okay, and this NXT term, the novelty itself, it's random. How is it described?
They use a novelty operator, NXT, which has a probabilistic distribution. This means it doesn't have a fixed value, but rather a certain probability of having different values.
And they mention a specific distribution, something that sounds like phosphorus mononitride.
Yes, the transcript uses that phrase. Phosphorus mononitride equals 2ps21 express minus 2 sigma 2n2. Now, phosphorus mononitride sounds, well, chemically specific and maybe out of place.
A bit weird, yeah. An AI quirk, maybe? Or a placeholder?
Could be. But the mathematical form itself, that express minus n squared part, strongly suggests they're talking about a Gaussian distribution. The classic bell curve shape.
Ah, okay, the bell curve. That makes more sense, probabilistically. So, what part of that Gaussian formula is key for novelty here?
The crucial parameter is the standard deviation, usually shown as the Greek letter sigma. In their notation, it looks like sigma and then n with this subscript 2.
Okay, standard deviation, sigma. Remind me, what does that tell us in simple terms?
Think about the bell curve shape. Sigma tells you how spread out the curve is. A small sigma means a tall, narrow curve. Most events are very close to the average, not much variation.
Right.
A large sigma means a short, wide curve events are more spread out, and there's a higher chance of getting values far from the average.
So in this novelty context, a larger sigma would mean?
It would mean a higher likelihood of larger deviations from the norm, more significant wobbles in the flux. So a reality with a large sigma in its novelty operator might be one where more frequent and maybe more drastic novel events are likely to emerge.
It's like a measure of the universe's inherent potential for surprise at that fundamental level.
That's a good way to put it, a measure of the wiggliness or probabilistic freedom built into the flux. A small sigma would imply a more stable, predictable reality at its base.
Okay, interesting. So a universe could, in theory, have a high sigma setting, making bizarre things more common. But wait, does every single tiny wobble, every fluctuation, become a real new thing we see?
So apparently not. That's where the concept of a novelty threshold comes in.
A threshold, like a minimum requirement.
Exactly. They introduce a function for this, written as hn minus nc equals 10 if n greater than nc otherwise.
Whoa, okay, let's break that down. N is the size of the perturbation, the wobble.
Yes, represents the magnitude of that novelty fluctuation.
And in Eck, that's the critical threshold.
Correct. NC is the minimum size of fluctuation n needs to reach to actually count.
And the function says if n is bigger than any, the function value is 1. I think they meant 1, not 10. And if it's smaller, the value is 0.
Precisely, assuming 1 for manifests and 0 for doesn't. So like a gatekeeper. If the wobble n is big enough to cross the threshold NC, it registers as actual observable novelty, h equals 1.
But if it's too small below NSE, it just remains a background fluctuation. H equals 0. It doesn't bubble up into our perceived reality as something distinctly new.
That's the idea. So even if there are countless tiny probabilistic nudges happening constantly at this Planck scale level, or whatever level this pulse operates at, only the ones that cross that critical antisant line actually manifest as novelty that could potentially be observed or interact with the larger system. It's like the universe filters out the microjitters.
So putting it together, according to this model, something completely new could, theoretically, pop into existence from a random probabilistic wobble in this fundamental cosmic pulse. And whether that happens depends on the inherent probability distribution, that sigma value, and whether this specific wobble is big enough to clear this novelty threshold, an ACE.
That captures it well. It frames novelty not as something injected from outside, but as an inherent potential within the fundamental flux, modulated by its interaction with consciousness and these probabilistic rules.
It's a fascinating way to think about where newness originates.
And if you step back, you see they're trying to build a mathematical structure that accounts for not just the stuff of reality matter, energy, but also its dynamic evolution, the constant emergence of new information, new structures.
Okay, let's maybe try and pull these threads together. We've taken quite a journey here.
We have.
We started with this wild idea of reality pulsing 22 trillion times a second, a pulse deeply connected to a field of consciousness.
Right. The fundamental flux.
Then we saw how they try to model this flux mathematically using a wave function, but also that Dirac delta for the instantaneous creation-destruction bit.
And linking it to the consciousness field via that scalar field equation, including the self-interaction term.
Yeah. And then we tackled novelty, how new things might emerge from probabilistic wobbles, the perturbations in the flux.
Described by that Gaussian-like distribution with its standard deviation, sigma, indicating the potential for variation.
And filtered by the novelty threshold, SC, so only significant fluctuations actually manifest.
And it's crucial to remember this is one theoretical framework, developed with AI assistants, attempting to build physics from a different starting point.
Consciousness first, essentially, viewing matter and energy as emerging from this pulsing conscious field.
Exactly. That's the core philosophical shift it represents.
So what for you listening to this? Well, it offers a radically different lens for viewing the universe, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests consciousness and energy aren't separate things, but deeply interwoven. That maybe time itself isn't fundamental, but emerges from this rapid pulse rate.
And maybe most intriguing, it offers a potential mechanism for how new things constantly come into being, not randomly from nowhere, but as an intrinsic feature of reality's basic rhythm.
It definitely pushes the boundaries of current science. It makes you wonder, if consciousness were fundamental like this, What could that explain? Could it help understand phenomena that puzzle current models?
Like what? Maybe things related to observation in quantum mechanics or subjective experience itself?
Potentially. It could inspire completely new ways to think about energy, information, how change happens. It's provocative, to say the least.
Absolutely. Now, we know this has been dense, some very abstract, complex ideas. We really appreciate you sticking with us and exploring this.
Yeah, engaging with these kinds of far-out theoretical models, even if they seem purely speculative, it's valuable. It stretches your perspective, challenges assumptions about how reality has to work.
It really does. Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you to chew on. If, and it's a big if reality is governed by something like this fundamental pulse and shaped by consciousness, what does that imply about novelty?
Meaning, are there limits, or is the potential unlimited?
Exactly. What are the ultimate limits or maybe the untapped potential for new things to emerge in such a system? Could we, theoretically, influence the odds? Could consciousness itself nudge the probabilities of new possibilities coming into being?
That's a fascinating question. The intersection of what seem like fundamental laws, the probabilistic nature of novelty in this model, and the potential influence of consciousness. What could emerge from that interplay?
Something to ponder. The relationship between the rules of the game and the constant arrival of the new.